Good evening and a warm welcome to Green Templeton College, and to those of us joining online from home. This is the second of our flagship lectures of 2023 on the subject of philanthropy. In February, Dr. Josh Yates gave the first lecture on unlocking the benefits of venture philanthropy, and on the 5th of June, the Right Honourable Rory Stewart will give a talk at the Mathematical Institute about his relationship with philanthropy and his current role as president of Give Directly. Tonight, we are delighted to be joined by Anne-Birgitte Albrectsen for our second lecture, and she will be introduced in a moment by our chair for this evening's event, Associate Fellow Caroline Greenhalgh. Caroline is, as I said, an Associate Fellow of the College. She's a member of the Principal Circle and Executive Director of Three Dimensional Impact Limited, a consultancy working with funders and charities to identify sustainable and innovative solutions that are both impactful and scalable. Now, after Anne-Birgitte has spoken, Caroline and Ranjit Majumdar will chair a question and answer session with Anne-Birgitte. They will take questions from the in-person audience and also from the online audience. If you're in the room, please raise your hand and the GTC team will pass around a microphone. We would also like to hear from our online audience, so please feel free to post questions in the YouTube chat. And at the end of the evening, current Green Templeton College Master's student Heather Jost will close this evening's event at around 7 o'clock. So without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to welcome tonight's chair and series co-convener, Caroline Greenhalgh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. And good evening and welcome to everyone joining us this evening, both online and in person. It's my huge pleasure and a great privilege to welcome this evening's speaker, Anne-Birgitte Albrectsen. Anne-Birgitte is a renowned leader and advocate for human rights and social justice. And she is also a global strategic advisor, a mentor and a transformative leader who has worked tirelessly to empower women and girls in some of the world's most challenging environments and has made significant contributions and has made significant contributions to the fields of international development and humanitarian aid. With more than 30 years of experience in the private, public and non-profit sectors, Anne-Birgitte has become a respected voice and thought leader across the global community. Anne-Birgitte has held many prominent leadership positions, including positions at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund, as CEO of Plan International, one of the world's leading child rights organisations, and as CEO of the Lego Foundation. As if this wasn't enough, Anne-Birgitte has also founded and created several global partnerships. Today, Anne-Birgitte is the founder and CEO of ABA Global Action, which advises leaders seeking to create value in the workplace, in their communities and internationally through the promotion of the SDGs and human rights. When not working, Anne-Birgitte enjoys golf, gardening, travel, sports, good food and wine, and also reading. When asked for a book recommendation recently, Anne-Birgitte recommended Pippi Longstocking for its many great lessons for girls, agency and ingenuity. The subject of Anne-Birgitte's talk this evening is co-impact philanthropy. It will come as no surprise to learn that Anne-Birgitte is a great advocate for the power of partnerships and collaboration to change systems and attitudes. Please join me in welcoming Anne-Birgitte Albrectsen.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for inviting me to be the second lecturer in this series. And I love the fact that you asked us lecturers to explore whether philanthropy has a problem with evidence under the umbrella of seeing is believing. Now, a super leading question, I would say. And I suspect we all know that that can only be answered affirmatively. Today, I'll argue that there's very little seeing, believing, learning, daring, and collaborating in the world of philanthropy and global development. It's a systemic problem that I'll unpack, and I'll also venture a few ways of fixing it. My critique will in no way take away from the incredible work that obviously is being undertaken, the great ideas, the changes that are being promoted, both in the non-profit sector as a whole in terms of global development and in philanthropy specifically. But there are many things that need to be fixed, and I'll try and unpack some of that. Now, I was asked for a title for today's lecture and chose The Never Walk Alone, Co-Impact Philanthropy. Of course, first and foremost, because I'm a fan of Liverpool Football Club. And then, of course, because I believe that only through collaboration can philanthropy address the deep systemic issues that need to be addressed for the world to become a better place. There is no such thing as a single intervention funded by a single philanthropist that will change what needs to be changed in the world. My experience tells me that collaborative approaches will generally promote more effective, sustainable, contextually appropriate, ethical, and trusted interventions that are better aligned with the needs of those that we all purport to serve. And my starting point is that activities and projects that do not meet that test should not exist at all. Now, the title is also a nod to Olivia Leland and the wonderful folks at coimpact.org, a network of philanthropists that pool resources to work collectively towards shared goals. I spoke to Olivia just 2 days ago, and she said, you know, AB, I think that we're probably under 5% of philanthropic activity that is done collectively and that goes through pooled resources. And I had a sense that that was correct, but it was nice that she confirmed that, because this is what she works with every single day. Fundamentally also for me is that philanthropists, to be successful, must recognize that they, despite the fact that they have an awful lot of money, don't have all the answers, and that they should never walk alone, but instead actively work together and then walk with and behind those that they serve, not ahead of them. This type of humble leadership, regretfully, often runs counter to egos, brands, perceptions, unconscious biases, and power dynamics across the global development sector. And philanthropy must change to be able to co-create meaningfully. Now, Ranjit first contacted me in November last year. And I don't know if you noticed the coincidence, but it was exactly the same week as we first heard about ChatGPT. Now, drawn by that coincidence, I actually took chunks of what I was going to say tonight and I popped it in there. And I asked it to come out with a quote embodying the essence of what I'm going to say. And ChatGPT threw out the following: design with, not for, and the most meaningful and effective solutions are co-created by many, especially with the communities they serve, taking into account their unique needs, perspectives, and aspirations. So my husband was watching this as I was doing it, and he's also spent over 30 years in international development, and he says, yeah. I mean, we know that. And yet we could both quickly agree that it all too often doesn't happen. That despite all the evidence that exists, that this needs to happen, top-down, donor-driven solutions still dominate the global development sector. In fact, many push solutions without fully even defining the problem that they want to solve. Okay, let me take a little bit of time to explore another related area between evidence and philanthropy. And that's evidence about philanthropy itself. Now, we all know in the earliest form, the word philanthropy came from Greek and meant love of humanity. The meaning of the word has evolved over time, but since the earliest days of our civilization, we've depended on kindness directed to strangers. Today, we often think of philanthropy as organized and systemic giving that improves human life through promotion of well-being and social change. Under this definition, we find corporate, family philanthropy of huge sorts, which are encouraged by good tax incentives. Regularly, we see them, just like today, the admirable Bloomberg basically took his entire company and gave it to his philanthropy and said, my family has earned enough money, I'm now going to give my company to my philanthropy. Huge headline. It was all over. When I opened, just as I was coming over here, it was there. Mr. Bloomberg has done this. And I love that. We see charts that show this impressive growth in philanthropy. It's coming at us every day. I've seen so many of those charts. Now, if you examine the evidence a little bit behind that, you will find that despite these headline-grabbing donations, if you look at US philanthropy alone, which is one of the biggest markets, the share of philanthropy of US GDP has stayed the same at about 2% over the last 50 years. So the volume has increased, but the relative share of philanthropy is the same. Now, the Charities Aid Foundation, CAF, produces the wonderful World Giving Index, and they've done that for more than 10 years. Now, their latest report shows that COVID-19 has completely changed the landscape of charitable giving. Many of the countries that were stalwarts and on the top 10 of their list of top performers, UK, US, Ireland, Australia, Anglo-Saxon, and the Netherlands, have dropped not just to the top 20, but out of the top 20. And instead, they've been replaced by countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, Kosovo. Indonesia is ranked first on the CAF World Giving Index, and they note that more than 8 in 10 individuals donated money in 2021. And the country's rate of volunteering is more than 3 times the global average. Now, our northern, Western narrative of philanthropy in no way, shape, or form captures that reality. Similarly, we tend to narrate that only the wealthy give. Many surveys have found that not only do the poor donate per capita more than individuals in the higher income brackets, but their generosity tends to last through times of hardship. The poorer you are and the harder the circumstances are, the more you give. Now, a wonderful example of this is an organization whose board I will join very shortly, CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education. Now, CAMFED is today a Pan-African movement revolutionizing the way that girls get educated, move into leadership positions, and move into philanthropy and giving back. For each girl that CAMFED reaches, when they become adults, they help educate 5 girls. And that's in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Ghana. And the growth of local philanthropy is enormous through just one single initiative. Globally, more people reported that they helped a stranger in 2020 than ever previously reported in the World Giving Index. Helping a stranger is the most commonly performed giving behavior across the world, and over half of the world's adults give. And yet when we talk about philanthropy, we think of Mr. Bloomberg, or we think of, you know them all, in terms of name recognition. Now, another common assumption is that philanthropy automatically results in redistribution of money. Now, that's also not evidence-based. A lot of philanthropy favors grants to institutions that favor those that have. In the UK alone, in the 10-year period leading up to 2017, which is the last time the study was done, more than 2/3 of all millionaire donations in the UK, and that's £5 billion, sorry folks, went to higher education. And half of it went to Oxford and Cambridge. British millionaires, during the same decade where they donated 5 billion amazing funds to higher education, donated 220 million to poverty alleviation. Notably, the growing global inequality crisis and the financial system that underpins it generally cannot be tackled, especially by corporate philanthropy, whose capital has benefited from the system, and only a few truly independent thinking foundations operate in this space. I'd like to give a real big shout out to the Loudest Foundation, led by Leslie Johnston, that dare to tackle some of the biggest inequality problems of our time, and I'll get back to them and what they do. Now, foundations and big philanthropy do need to change, and the Loudest Foundation and coimpact.org are at the forefront of that and driving the most progressive thinking in the philanthropy sector. Now, another misconception, of course, is that this call for philanthropy to change is something very recent. We've got super champions of philanthropy change, like the president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker. But already 50 years ago, a very special person to all of us, Martin Luther King, called out that philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause philanthropies to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary. And when we forget that, philanthropy essentially loses all meaning. I would add my own interpretation to what that actually means, and that means that philanthropy cannot stop at kindness, but must add driving change and real empathy. Of course, behind the growing call to decolonize philanthropy lie a real anger and impatience amongst many citizens of what I hate to call the global South, of the lack of seeing, the lack of empathy, and the slow pace of change that they observe. And they're obviously calling for new ways of building philanthropy and organizing philanthropy. And we still need to investigate exactly what decolonizing philanthropy fully means, but I'm confident that it will contribute significantly both to better evidence and to better co-impact. Now let me get to perhaps some solutions. So I've come up with 6 shifts that need to happen as a minimum. And these shifts are not based on deep academic study. They are built on my 30 years of being a practitioner. And I noticed up here that that's what you're all about, bringing academics and practitioners together. So the first shift, the way we talk about impact needs to change. Too often, actors in global development, all of them, but most forcefully funders, and not just philanthropists, talk about my impact, not our collective impact, but my impact. So the impact of the Lego Foundation, or the impact of Plan International, or the impact of CAMFED, those organizations that I know really well. And I believe this is a complete illusion. Because impact, and I'm not talking outputs, I'm not talking how many vaccine jabs did we put in the arm of somebody, but true impact, true sustainable change they happen in here. They happen in shifts in mindsets. They happen in the aha moments of a community leader that decides with his co-community leaders that things need to shift, that power dynamics need to shift, that we need to do things different tomorrow than we did yesterday. And that is never an individual organization's doing, because there'll be societal pressures, there'll be a new way of designing a program, there will be conversations, there will be national legislation, there will be lots of things. So the idea that you can attribute impact to a single organization is an absolutely wrong starting point. Firstly, it also speaks to a fundamental disregard and disrespect of the program participants that actually do the hard work. Secondly, the way we speak about impact silences the fundamental truth of that attitudinal behavior shift that needs to happen. And thirdly, despite these first two realities, talking about a single entity impact drives what I would call a proliferation of bespoke, entity-specific priorities, results frameworks, data, systems requirements, monitoring and evaluation efforts that not only add complexity and cost entity by entity, but also fragment the sector. We were talking earlier tonight about how some of the organizations that have been leading in results-based management have such rigid results-based systems that when they go and try and collaborate with others with rigid results-based systems, it becomes incredibly hard to collaborate because the systems requirements get in the way of collaboration. Or in other words, like Olivia Leland said from Co-Impact, it leads to less ambitious projects or programs, those that are truly needed for the systemic change to shift social justice. Of course, you can find a little project over here where you've bent yourself into your different results systems and you've come together and you've wavered all your rules in your organizations to do it. But that will tend to lead to small projects because it's too hard to do it at the biggest, at big scale. Now, my second shift would be, we need to understand that different stakeholders in the global development system have different reasons and different requirements for evidencing impact. And we have to build in all the requirements, not just the funders' requirements. Now, as a donor or institutional philanthropist, I might need evidence of what works or has worked, hasn't worked, etc., to make funding decisions. As a private giver, I might simply enjoy hearing stories and the gratitude of those that I have given money to. If I lead a global NGO, I need evidence that is specifically related to how I design better programs in the future. If I'm a government representative in the country that's receiving these funds, I need data, evidence to make sure that what all these donors and programs and organizations are doing in my country actually adds up to a coherent whole. And if I'm a young person or a community member in a very disadvantaged communities, I actually need to satisfy myself that what's going on with me and my community will do no harm. and that I will be able to take something away from that. Now, those are very different requirements of data and evidence of impact and what works. But very often, we're driven by the fact that the donors need a certain type of evidence to make good funding decisions. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just driving the majority of the evidence that's there today. Now, I believe that to satisfy all these different needs, it's imperative that researchers and evaluators and their funders see the communities as dynamic, expert citizens instead of static end users. The world is changing so fast that the preference to wait to find knowledge until the end of the project is just downright wrong. We're missing the dynamism in the world today. And of course, we also must address that program evaluations are predominantly conducted and funded by us in the global north, and conducted often by staff that have no idea of the lived realities of the people that they're evaluating. And of course, many of the mainstream evaluation approaches are also built here and elsewhere. And then I'd like to just quote a final time Leslie from Co-Impact. No, sorry, wrong. From Lauder's Foundation. And she said, even for corporate philanthropy, it's true that philanthropy is not a business. So let's drop the bespoke business metrics, the KPIs, the log frames, and let's move to more dynamic learning approaches. We have adopted, without critique, a measuring system which was designed for business. Some of that can be used, but it certainly needs to be adapted to the realities of the sector. Third, we need to redefine what we consider good data and evidence of impact. Now, institutional philanthropy, deeply committed to learning and evidence, can actually afford to fund different types of evidence gathering and making. They also have patient capital, many of them. They are not driven by electoral cycles. We've got to have a result in the next 4 years because otherwise we won't get elected. They have long-term patient capital, and they have quite a bit of it. Now, there's a certain type of evidence which we have very little of. Meta-evaluations. So evaluations that take evaluations done around the system and actually comes up with an aggregate picture of what works and doesn't work. Very few of them because they're super, super costly. And they're also quite hard, but again, philanthropy has a role to play. We also, longitudinal studies, 10-year, 20-year studies that compare development over time. You know them, they're wonderful. They give us a super amount of insight. Very little of it is funded by the philanthropy that would really benefit from it. I have to say that my previous employer, the Lego Foundation, funded many longitudinal studies, and it added an awful lot to the evidence base that they used. One of the things that I would have loved to see, and I don't think I've ever seen one, is the global development world, because it's so driven by its own impact, tends to also segment where they work. So you'll go into a province in eastern Zimbabwe, there are 17 districts, and the different actors have divided these districts between them. So Plan International works in District 1, World Vision works in District 2, UNICEF works in District 3, because then we can at least try and attribute our impact to ourselves. Now, what if somebody went in and instead of evaluating the work of Plan and World Vision, etc., went in and said, we'll actually evaluate all of you together. We'll fund it together, we'll learn together, we'll see, and we will in this particular area really learn together. Very little of that kind of evidence gathering is going on. The other thing that philanthropy can do is to insist on closing the data gaps for the most marginalized and non-dominant groups. We have very, very little data on the most vulnerable. And there's a reason for that. Often there's a political reason for that. Often there's a power interest in not measuring the socioeconomic status of a certain excluded ethnic group. You really don't want to know. But what philanthropy can do is say, we want to know. The world needs to know who the world's most marginalized people are. We must also close that often unspoken power imbalance in data collection, analysis, and ownership. We need to talk about why there's often too much data in some areas, data for fundraising, for example, and what we can all do to protect the data of the most vulnerable. Every staff member at Plan International will have heard me talk about this, so I'm not outing my old organization. But Plan International had the most wonderful data collection methodology. Every single year they went into villages, they went to the sponsored children, they had a questionnaire, lots of data. They probably hold the world's largest database with socioeconomic data points on children, 1.5 million children. The main use of that, not the total use of that, but the main use of that was to produce an annual letter to its sponsors. It was a wonderful letter, had lots of information about how the child that was being sponsored had advanced and done, etc. Think of the gold mine of data that anybody probably in this room or beyond would say, yeah, we can get insights from this data in a way. And there's so much more data in the world than we use and use well. I'd like to just make a little shout out, and I wrote a blog about it recently and others have as well. But the way we treat data and personal data of the most vulnerable populations in the world is an absolute travesty. The protection that we afford ourselves, GDPR, all these things that we've become so used to in our part of the world, is not the way that humanitarian organizations and development organizations treat the data of individuals. Now, it's becoming better, but just imagine what happens when you hold personal data about the most vulnerable in the world. We had regular attempts at Plan International by what Scotland Yard called organized crime to access the personal data of vulnerable children. And you can just imagine what they might use that for. And if we don't insist on the best, highest standards of protection of the most vulnerable people in the world and their data, we are causing an awful lot of harm as we collect data for our various purposes. My fourth point would be we have to completely shift accountability models. Accountability for affected populations, AAP, is a concept that's used more and more in the humanitarian world, which is an active commitment to use our power as funders, as international organizations, responsibly by taking account of, giving account to, and being held to account by those that we serve. It's again about power. Large operational INGOs or even small INGOs or NGOs often see themselves as primarily accountable to the donor and not to those that they serve. And of course, accountability to donors is super important, but AAP needs to be our first priority. Let me go back to CAMFED that I mentioned before. Accountability to girls and young women they serve is foundational and absolutely non-negotiable for them. And it also drives how they work with their funders. Now, data and insight and evidence is first and foremost collected by them. And when I say by them, it's actually by community participants, it's leaders, it's teachers, it's health workers, it's the young girls themselves. And they pool that data to gather insight locally to design better programs, identify the most vulnerable, and design better programs. And then secondarily, they use that data to report to their funders. But it's a complete shift in mindset that's needed in many parts of the system. We also need to hold philanthropy itself to account. Big philanthropy, some of the world's largest foundations have the monetary and knowledge power to contribute to solving the world's biggest problems. I listened to a podcast just the other day about Novo Nordisk, one of the world's largest medical or pharmaceutical companies. They have now become so big that their contribution, their philanthropic contribution, is almost the same size as that of the country in which they were born, in Denmark. And of course, we think that the Novo Nordisk Foundation is doing amazing thing. It's transforming how we think, and diabetes and everything else in the world, but it's not a given that the philanthropic foundation will have the same priorities as those democratic politicians in the countries in which they work. And so who holds them to account for making sure that they make the right choices? Very few. And it is a democratic deficit that we have to be thinking about in terms of the uber-large philanthropies. Thank goodness, many of them are doing amazing things. But what if they decided not to? Now, fifth, transparency and data sharing must be a core business model. The entire sector of global development is mired by my impact, my data. What if it was our data? Yes, data that we share with those that we serve, but even if we shared it amongst ourselves, the insights could be so much bigger. Now, a wide range of evidence points can help address also the disagreements around whether aid actually works. Regardless of what the evidence shows, I do concur with publish what you fund, that aid transparency has to be the common ground. Even if you hate it or if you love it, it has to be the common ground that we have to have complete transparency. Now, governments and aid institutions have actually come a long way, but philanthropy has not followed suit. They are not nearly as transparent as the rest of the sector, and we need to insist on that. Again, back to the point of sharing the data with the communities that we serve. Only through transparency and sharing data can the communities themselves hold their governments and service providers to account for using the money that they get in the right way. It's a huge deterrent to corruption if they have true insight and transparency on what's supposed to come to them but doesn't come to them. Final point. We have to learn to love failure. I was just saying to Caroline that maybe we need a global failure institute or center. And we have to learn to love the most nutty problems, knotty problems, the most difficult topics. And we've got to learn to love the unknown. When risk of failure or past failure drives philanthropy, we're missing the opportunity for innovation and leapfrogging. We need a complete paradigm shift. It's time to move from a failure mindset where evaluation is the end, poor evaluation, stop project, move on, but it's actually the beginning. An evaluation that points to many failures, but with an organization that's ready to learn and adapt. As a philanthropist, that's where I'd put my money, because you're imagining that they're learning from their mistakes and not just building a certain arrogance from going from success to success to success. And also, if evaluation is the end, it lets everybody off the hook. You're not actually holding anybody to account for the mistakes that might have been made in the project. I believe that investing in and giving grants to organizations that show the ability to learn constantly is the right way forward. And similar statements can be made about philanthropists that are willing to use adaptation and iteration as a mode of operating, rather than rigidly sticking to their mission, strategy, and tried and true approaches. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, the US former First Lady, and you'll know this quote, I'm sure, but she took the globe by storm in 1901 when she said, "Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people." Now, this was paraphrased by a colleague at the Lotus Foundation when she told me we need bolder philanthropy that focuses more on ideas than on actions, on bolder transformative ideas and not just on projects. And it gives me the opportunity to return briefly to the issue of the philanthropy dilemma or contradiction. It shows up regularly in relation to an unwillingness to fund difficult and hard to measure issues. Many wealthy families shy away from ideas of supporting social justice issues, in equal part because of the political implications, their own vested interests, and the lack of data and evidence about, as I said before, the most marginalized populations. Many tend to play it safe. Many would still say that the common motivation for philanthropy is not to change, but to help. Many large institutional philanthropists choose areas to fund with hard evidence of success. It is not by chance that over 50% of philanthropy in global development goes to global health. Health is a sector that is born out of measurement and hard data. And it's also a way to give philanthropists, fast feedback on what their investment leads to. And there's almost no funding for human rights movements, for dignity and respect, or for changing harmful norms and practices, because it's really hard to measure. And there's almost no philanthropy in prevention, because how do you measure that something didn't occur because of your investment? Now, we know from the humanitarian sector that if the same amount of money that's invested in the humanitarian sector was invested in preventing it from happening, the costs would be a seventh. You would reduce the money going into life-saving in emergencies, and you could use just a seventh of that for prevention, and a lot of that money could go into other things. Now, in conclusion, I will close with a small friendly nudge to my friends here at Green Templeton College. I know that your aspiration is to encourage philanthropy to be better informed by rigorous evidence and maximizing its impact. And you seek to make sure that philanthropy is contributing to real change. You have wonderful mission statements. You're known for being this meeting point of practitioners and professionals and the academic world. And everybody in your student body, or a lot of your student body, I'm told, aspire to be part of shaping the world, not just observing it. Now, by only asking the question, does philanthropy have a problem with evidence, you could potentially be missing a chance to support a more fundamental shift that we need in the sector and we need in philanthropy. By tweaking your question, you could also be changing the way evidence is defined, gathered, held, owned, assessed, communicated, and curated, and by doing so, you can shape the nature of philanthropy. You can help make sure that no investments are made without being fully informed by the lived experiences of the communities and the people that philanthropy wants to serve. You can shape the way that impact is created and sustained, and you can advance the transformative change and close the growing trust gap between the global north and the global south, and the haves and the have-nots. Now take it from a practitioner, but you know this real well, that real impact happens when we ask the right questions. Thanks. Am I supposed to sit? Just look in the middle.
You go in the middle. So thank you so much, Anne-Birgitte, for your thought-provoking lecture and for challenging the way in which philanthropy works. You've reminded us of the need to shift mindsets if we are to succeed in generating the systemic change that we so urgently need. I particularly love your idea for a global centre of failure, which we discussed before, and for your call for a paradigm shift in how we view failure, and also for your challenge to philanthropy to fund prevention. And I've taken notes of your suggestion for tweaking our question, and I'm confident we will be revisiting this shortly. I won't take any more time, as I know there are many of you who have questions for Anne-Birgitte. I'm delighted to invite my colleague Ranj Majumdar to join us for the Q&A. Ranj has been monitoring the online audiences and will share some of the questions with us. We would like to hear from our online audience, so do please post your questions in the chat. Please can we have the first question? Yes, thank you.
Hi. Hello? Is it on? Can you guys hear me? I'll just speak loudly. Hi, Anne-Birgitte. Thank you so much for your talk. And I really love all that you've talked about in terms of shifting the way that we think about data, because I do think a big part of the action that a lot of fundraisers take is based on some of the requirements of the people who are actually funding the money, and you have to follow where the money goes. Can you just give us a little bit of insight into the conversations you've been having at that level of folks who are leading foundations, leading philanthropies, when you say, hey, can we rethink about what evidence looks like? I imagine there's a lot of pushback. I would love to just hear what those conversations have been and what they're looking for and what the appetite is to reduce the requirements and definitions of data. Thank you.
Should we take a second question? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really inspiring. I lead an NGO, just so you can place me, Camilla Knox-Peebles, and I'm CEO of Amref Health Africa, UK. I'm really interested in your concept of collaboration, and I'd love to hear whether you can give us some examples of where you've seen that happen, what the impact has been, how you would define it given everything that you've been saying, and and what is there any more learning for us as NGOs in how to do that?
Yeah.
Why did it work? How did it work? And so, thanks.
I mean, maybe just quickly to the conversations with funders, both having worked as a funder and been on the other side of the table. I actually don't think when you sit down at the table that the resistance is immediately very high. I think what often happens is that funders sit, define their own priorities, create their results frameworks based on that. They're driven by their own KPIs, etc. If you tell them, actually, this doesn't work for me, they might tweak one or two of the measures, etc. And we move on, and we're all interdependent, let's say that, in the sector. So of course we listen to what the funders' priorities are, and we try and refine it, etc. One thing that Co-Impact does is to actually have the NGOs, say, that come and pitch to them, pitch to Co-Impact and not pitch to Gates Foundation and Lego Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation, etc. I mean, if somebody pitched to the Lego Foundation, they would say learning through play 700 times, because that's the priority of the Lego Foundation. And if they pitch to Bill Gates, they would say data, data, data all the time. But what Co-Impact does is actually create this space where the NGOs can talk more about their ideas and the change that they want to make, and where there's more time for listening to what's needed in terms of the data and evidence to drive that idea. And then they go back, in that collective of pool funds and find the best ideas and the best pitches. And I love that it doesn't become that one-on-one drive to satisfy the needs of a particular philanthropist. And just to answer your question, one example I can give, we were just talking about it before, the 6 largest child-focused agencies in the world, they came together under the umbrella of something called Joining Forces, and chose violence against children as a common theme to actually try and break down some of those, age-old competitive elements that there are in that sector, and really tried to drive that through. And what actually happened is when they came together, the first funder that supported that was the EU, and they said, actually, just the sheer fact that you came together and showed us that you could sit in the same room and you could work together, it brought additive funding. So it brought more funding into violence against children, about 10 million euro, simply by the sheer fact that a donor saw, oh, for crying out loud, how wonderful is it that they got over themselves, left their egos and brands at the door, and actually focused on the impact that they wanted to create.
Paul.
Thanks for your talk, AB. I wondered if I could ask you to say a bit more about incentives and perverse incentives. You said a little bit about this business of my project and how that in sometimes is used as an incentive to encourage donors. And here in the UK, we offer donors tax relief, gift aid, on their donations, where taxpayers then subsidise philanthropists for their kind donations, irrespective of what they choose to spend the money on. A perverse incentive, perhaps. Could you say a bit more about how we handle these difficult kind of incentive problems, particularly with tax?
I'll try.
Should we take a couple of questions? Yeah. So we'll have an online question, and then the gentleman over here in the room. Ranj, do you want to share all the questions online?
Yeah, if I may. And I just wanted to, I'm slightly going to repackage this question, if the person who's posed it will sort of forgive me. You talked a little bit about the import into the non-profit sector of the terminology from the business sector, KPIs, the dreaded return on investment. But what is the way in which wealth is generated, by business? What does that tell us about the way in which philanthropists think about the way that money is expended in the non-profit sectors?
Should we take the third question, or are we going to do these two first?
No, maybe let me do it quickly. I actually think there's no doubt that the tax incentives whether it's for big philanthropy or for us as private individuals, is an important way to make the wealthy part of the world give more. As some of the evidence showed from CAF, if you're super poor, you help anyway. But somehow there's a barrier. The richer we get, the more incentives we need to give it away. I have no problem with the tax incentives. I think it's not necessarily destroying the way that we're giving. I think some of the perverse incentives that I see relate to the way that the funding is given. I mean, there's that drive for measuring individual impact over collective impact, the drive for incentivizing those that can create the most evidence of past success. As we know, past success is not always the best measure of future success. So there are some incentives in the system that at least could lead us to perpetuating a system of inequality rather than advancing a new way of thinking. This particular question, let me just try it on me one more time. So it's how business measures its own success and how that translates into how they see.
I think it's more about the extent to which the way that businesses pursue profit and the way that they run business towards this idea of profit maximization, how that influences the way that they think that philanthropy should happen.
I think I see it most, actually both in the INGO sector and in philanthropy, as a mindset of a straight linear approach from input to output to impact. And certainly when you've worked as many years as I have in global development, there's no such thing. There is no linear way. And certainly when you're working in the most disrupted communities, in the most disadvantaged places in the world, where they get disrupted every single day by all sorts of things. There's sometimes a very different narrative in the boardroom of a philanthropy or an INGO, etc., and the real life work that goes on in the communities that we serve, because much of that business mindset is driven to very linear approaches.
Okay, there's a gentleman on my right.
Hi. Is this working? No, it is. I couldn't agree more with you about the need for collaborationist approaches and the example you gave there of collaboration over violence against children. But why is this the exception? Why doesn't it happen more? I've sat on Oxfam's board, on UNICEF UK and other boards, and I found two things that are impediment. One, of course, is fundraising, that these organizations employ fundraisers and they feel that they're competitive with, and that's one. But the other is that it's very time consuming, that it's easier for you as Plan to do it yourself. If you've got to collaborate with UNICEF and you're going to have to spend time, spend energy. But are there other factors that impede this? Because it is absolutely ridiculous. And I've just stepped down as a chair of a human rights organization. And it's one of the things that I felt equally passionate about, that the human rights organizations do not collaborate more. Fortunately, the one I was working with, Article 19 does, and it's in their DNA. Yeah, but I wouldn't say that of Amnesty. I wouldn't say that of Human Rights Watch. And yet it's crying out, and every year human rights around the world is more violated than the year before. So they're staring at evidence of failure. So why is this not happening?
I mean, you've pointed to two of them, but let me just hold on to the time issue. Why is it time consuming? Well, one of the ones I mentioned tonight is that you spend the first 6 months of trying to collaborate aligning your result systems. And you sit there and really, really thoughtful, hard-working individuals, try and align and squeeze their systems, etc. And then, yes, perhaps you get to the lowest common denominator rather than the highest common denominator. And that's super exhausting for everybody. I mean, we all know, even if you take a parallel issue, the whole conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the world, and we all know that the more diverse the group of people in the room are, initially, it will be more time-consuming because you need to learn, you need to listen, you need to understand, you need to use your empathetic part of your brain to actually understand the lived experiences of people in the room. But once you've done it, you get higher returns, you get better approaches, etc. But many NGOs, driven by some of that short-termism in both donor funding, etc., they never get, if you've sat in a room for 6 months trying to get to know each other and break down your result systems, most just walk away and say, that's okay, some donor wants us to collaborate, that's fine, we'll do a little bit over here. But it does take time, but you've got to accept that the time is well spent. And once you get to the other side of that, you will have greater impact. You'll be able to solve bigger problems. But there's a dearth of time. Of course there is. The world is burning, so we're all really impatient people as well. But there's got to be more time for that.
Do you have any more online questions, Ranj?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So can we take the gentleman, sorry, it's the lady on my right and then the gentleman on my left.
So thank you so much for your talk today. I think I wanted to hear a little bit more about some of the non-measurable aspects that you talked about. So for example, global health versus some social issues that might be difficult to gather quantitative evidence. How do you kind of start that conversation with investors when it's very much easier for them to sort of say, we have the hard evidence for global health, and you see quicker returns on that as well?
Should we take the next question? The gentleman on the left.
And thank you very much for your talk. As someone who works in the NGO space, actually in preventative medicine in the United States, I was wondering how can NGOs encourage co-impact philanthropy from their side of the relationship? Yes.
I think there's a big part of the non-profit sector that generally, I'll start with yours and I'll come back to yours, that starts with a scarcity mentality. So even before they go to the philanthropists, they've already self-censored themselves. And the ideas sort of have been formed to fit what they might get in through the door. So I think we also need to move from away from a scarcity mentality and focus on those big, bold ideas and have conversations about the problems that need fixing and create solutions around the problems, rather than sort of coming in with, I have a small solution here and I'll go to funders with that. I mean, there is something about the sector's mentality which I still haven't fully unpacked. I mean, I've lived in it many years myself, so it's not I don't have the perfect answer, but there is something about that scarcity mentality that prevents the right conversation to happen with philanthropies. Just remind me, just give me one word for your question.
The non-measurable.
The non-measurable, yes. I mean, there is a whole stream in evidence thinking, and I'm certainly not an expert, but around storytelling. And using, instead of hard data, using the stories, the lived experiences. And, I have found, and we were talking about this earlier, and I'll just give one example. This is not with philanthropy, but it's how a story and a lived experience can shift mindsets and decision makers and funders. So I sat 3 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday. There's always a crisis in global negotiations. Thursday night, the negotiations have to finish by Friday. And everybody's stuck. You've got, and this was about abortion rights and sexual and reproductive health and all the super difficult topics that are being discussed. And at a certain stage, at 3 o'clock in the morning, complete stalemate around youth and the girl child's rights. a young woman who had been brought in by a national delegation, so she was a youth representative on a delegation, stands up and talks about her body and her choices and her rights. And it swayed the room. And it got just enough votes over the line for the resolution to be adopted. And if we allow more lived evidence and storytelling of how things work and how the women's movement has worked. I was talking earlier today about one of the few, we all instinctively know that without the women's movement, the rights that I have today, they wouldn't exist. And yet there's only one true report of the impact that the women's movement has had on my rights that's been done. And I think it was done by Oxfam about 13 years ago or something like that. And that was based on interviews and stories and surveys, and it's hard evidence because it's all about what changed. And I think we used way too little testimonials and stories in our evidence gathering. Yes, we'll have a little focus group over here and we'll do a little bit of here, but it's not the same, and it doesn't come alive. And even the hard data we have gets stuck on a shelf and it doesn't get translated into real storytelling.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid our time is almost up, so thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. And I'd like to hand over to Heather Jost, who's our reporter, who's going to say a few words. Thank you, Heather.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Heather Jost, an MBA student and a member here at Green Templeton College. I'd like to first of all thank Anne-Birgitte for your illuminating lecture about how real impact can be pursued with an adjustment to how we see, do, and evaluate philanthropy. I loved having my assumptions corrected in terms of how much philanthropy there is, where it is growing the most, and who is doing the majority of the giving and serving. It was also powerful to consider what could happen if we collaborated a lot more in this sector, particularly in measurement, and especially when we prioritize the voices of those who are directly affected by the philanthropy. So that brings us to the end of what has been a fantastic evening here. Thank you to Sir Michael Dixon, Carolyn Greenhalgh, Ranj Mujamdar, and the whole GTC team for all of your support. And thank you for all of you for coming, all of you online for listening in, and have a great evening.